Hello and welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. I'm joined today by Deb Kilpatrick, co-CEO and executive chair at Evidation. We're going to talk a little bit about what Evidation does in the pharma space, in the healthcare space more generally, and about what they've learned about real-world data and real-world evidence. Welcome to the show, Deb.
Oh, thanks so much, Jonah. It's my pleasure to be here. And it was great to see you at JP Morgan and great to hear your voice here on this podcast.
Yeah, likewise. We had a lovely long chat at JPM that was not for, that wasn't on the record or anything. So that we haven't done anything with it. But I'm hoping to replicate some of that here and give our audience a little bit of insight into who you guys are and what you do. I think, as I said when we met in January, I think Evidation was very ahead of the curve when it comes to how we're thinking of health data now and real-world data and collecting data from folks using mobile devices as well as other means. And now that's, I think, a little more in vogue, you guys are really have quite an operation. So in case folks aren't familiar, talk to me a little bit about Evidation. What you do, what are all the pieces and how do they fit together?
Awesome. Thanks, Jonah. And happy to do that. So at Evidation, we always say our mission is to create new ways to measure and improve health in everyday life. And we do this across a wide variety of conditions and diseases and therapeutic areas. And we have pharma as a primary customer and partner, which is, I'm sure, part of the big interest of your audience here. And the reason that we do this is because everyday health experiences are the ones that traditionally have been invisible to the system, right? Because most of our lives are not spent as patients. Most of our lives are just spent as people in the world. And sometimes we're inside the clinic, but most of the time we're not. And that means there are missed opportunities to actually measure health more fully and hopefully improve it via those measurements. And at Evidation, our secret sauce really involves the leveraging of person-generated health data, or PGHD, you may hear me refer to it as, and refining that into new measures of health in the context of daily living. And we're extremely excited about what we do. You'll probably hear that in my voice. And I appreciate you saying that we were ahead of the curve, because I can tell you when we were talking about this and began talking about this a decade ago, we did get a lot of blank stares. And I'm proud to say we don't get blank stares anymore. And so we're excited to tell you more today on the podcast.
Can you give me just an example of what a typical project would look like, this kind of PGHD in action?
Sure. In fact, a very public example is our work on what's known as the Heartline trial. And the Heartline trial is an effort sponsored by Johnson & Johnson in conjunction with Apple. And Evidation is the tech and operations layer in the middle. And what we're doing is it's a multi-armed, randomized, pragmatic real-world trial to try and really understand what the best sort of patient flow or workflow would be in the context of a daily life and PGHD that a person is generating in order to identify the people who very likely do have true atrial fibrillation and should likely be on antithrombotics for stroke prevention. And the arms of that multi-arm trial are really rife with all this type of new real world data that you're describing. It's data from watches, it's data from phones, it's patient reported data through digitally delivered surveys through the phone. And we're really trying to identify what is the optimal path to get people who should be on antithrombotics because they have stroke risk due to AFib on antithrombotics because they have stroke risk due to AFib. And the first step of that is really about, looking at people in the real world and the data that's being used to holistically characterize their health day to day and use that as the triggers to get them into the system at the right time.
So for a study like that, who's the sponsor or the stakeholder who's putting up the resources to do it? Is it a pharma company or is this like an academic situation?
In the case of Heartline, it's being conducted by Johnson & Johnson and Apple. And so Johnson & Johnson's interest, of course, is they make antithrombotics, and which is first-line prevention measure for people who are at risk of stroke due to atrial fibrillation. Apple's interest is because they have AFib and arrhythmia notifications on the Apple Watch as one of their primary health sort of modules. And so there's a great deal of interest on both sides of that, and we care deeply about it because it's part and parcel to what we do, right? It's about characterization of health status using these types of new real world data and being able to use that in a way to measure health differently and use those measurements as a way to make sure people are getting the right care at the right time in this really sort of precision way. And so it's really a meeting of all three of these collaborators and entities, but it is sponsored by Apple and Johnson & Johnson.
When you work with pharma companies generally, how do you fit into the sort of typical relationship structure of sponsor, CRO, tech vendor, or is it kind of outside of that more traditional sort of clinical research framework?
Actually, it's a great question. Said another way, sort of what hats do we wear? What roles do we play in those types of relationships? And I would say it varies based on the product offering. So for pharma, we have sort of different types of, in the context of your question, research offerings. We do a lot of longitudinal observational studies, and we do a lot of registries as well that are also very often multi-year, very large scale. Generally, what we are doing is studying people who may or may not have a given condition, may or may not be on therapy, but in the context of post-approval research, phase 4, real-world evidence generation. In some cases, we are purely the tech layer. In some cases, we are the tech layer and the operations layer, which you may see from, sort of a digital or decentralized trial CRO. In some cases, we may even have an Evidation advisor or researcher who is the PI. So it can take very different. We sort of wear very different hats, Jonah, depending on the nature of the engagement. But that gives you a sense of the kinds of activities we play. I would say one of our newer offerings that we began working with pharma on last year is a research recruitment offering. And so that's sort of identification of community members in the Evidation connected population that may be eligible to enroll in other people's decentralized or digital studies. And that's been something that is a very exciting way for us to give value back to our members and also provide value to pharma by allowing them to access people at scale in a given therapeutic area very, very efficiently. And in those roles, we're purely the vendor in that case.
So that's a great segue, because I really wanted to talk about the front end of this too for the consumer, right? For the patient isn't the right word, but the person who's providing their data, the data donor almost. How do you bring those folks in? How do you, well, one, like what's the value prop for them? But two, how do you deal with some of the issues that come up around privacy and trust and making people feel like they're being treated right?
Sure. Well, just like we do our best to show up with scientific rigor and credibility for our enterprise customers and partners in the pharma channel, I think that it's perfectly reasonable for individuals and consumers to expect us to show up to them in a way that they expect in the context of their daily life. And this gets, very much to the question you're asking around, what are the incentives? Why should they do it? And how do we give them control over things like privacy and consent and data permissioning? When we invite someone to participate in an Evidation study or program, you can bet there's a reason why. There's a very good chance that it will be related to something that person cares about, is dealing with, and will be eligible for, or very likely to be eligible for, based on what they've told us about themselves. And that's one big way that we earn trust. The reason we keep trust over time is more in our approach to privacy controls, data permissioning, and consent for participation. For example, we match the permissioning and consent to the specifics of the use case. We don't really do generic blanket consents up front when they join the Evidation ecosystem, which is what most tech companies do, right? We just don't do that. We're very serious about this and have taken very public stances, including at the NIH, over the last decade on these matters. As to the incentive structure, we do ask. We do have a belief that if you do something, you should get something. And for some people, that something that they care about is actually being paid for data permissioning into our ecosystem or being paid for participation in a clinical study or in an Evidation observational study or program. And that's done on a routine basis. We do know from our own market research in our community from asking them that many people are motivated less by the money and motivated more by the opportunity to participate in a research ecosystem that they never had access to before. I mean, I think traditionally the percentage of U.S. adults that have participated in some kind of trial or observational study or registry is like far less than 10%. At one point, it was less than 5%. I think that's changing pretty rapidly now, but it's not uncommon for us to have participants from all 50 states, from 90% of U.S. zip codes, and from all kinds of educational and socioeconomic backgrounds. And so we believe that we have to provide different types of value. For some people, that's monetary, and for some people, that's sort of participation or more altruistic value.
That's a very, very interesting and complete answer. I did want to call attention to one thing you said, which was that you have a purpose-built agreement for every time you engage someone for their data, not a boilerplate.
Right.
Which is really interesting because there's a downside to that, right? I mean, it means that you aren't in the business of building databases. You're not like a lead gen or anything. Like you don't have like a big database of patients and people pay you for the data and you pull out that data and give it to them. Everything has to be kind of bespoke. You really are like setting up studies, and that's the product.
Yeah, that's a great point. We do not, where we are different from, what most people would say is the sort of real world data or real world evidence group of companies. Where we are very different is that we are not just in the business of selling, sort of de-identified data sets that everybody has the same access to, and they're just sort of putting it on their analytics layer and churning out, whatever data set somebody's asking for. Not to say that those things don't have value for things like hypothesis generation. But in our case, we really believe that the value is in the access to the individuals who are themselves permissioning data for the purposes of characterizing health differently. So we have a very different business model, and you see that in the way we talk about our sort of use case specific consents, our use case specific permissioning of data, and so yes, in that sense, it is bespoke in that sense, Jonah. That's a fair way to describe it.
Yeah, but I think that's really great. I mean, I think in this world that we live in, where our data is such a valuable thing, the idea of a data broker is kind of it makes people very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Maybe it should, So to move away from that and to say like, we're partners with pharma companies. We're also partnering with you.
Correct.
To create kind of a win-win situation. I think that's a really positive way to think about this whole ecosystem going forward, which sort of makes for a good segue to talk not just about evidation, but about kind of the trends that as you're in kind of a unique position to see. When we talked about how you guys have been at this for 10 years, you're not getting the blank looks anymore. But what have you seen in that time in terms of how industry is thinking about this real world data, this person generated data over that time through COVID and everything?
Yeah, maybe I should, even before answering that question, Jonah, sort of level set the way we see the data universe at Evidation, because, you've heard me talk about the person-generated hemisphere. There's a system-generated hemisphere, right? And we see those two sort of hemispheres as really being the complete characterization when they come together of our modern definition of health characterization, right? And so to the heart of your question, let's start with the fact that unlike 10 years ago, it is widely recognized now that person-generated health data has a very important role to play in characterizing health in the real world, in the context of our everyday life. So our view of human health is just simply put no longer limited to being episodic based on when we happen to be in a clinic setting. That's kind of huge. Like when you stand back from it and look back again 10 years ago, it's very, very important. Some might say like revolutionary versus evolutionary thing. But beyond that, it's becoming clear that the system-generated data, sort of this other hemisphere of the data universe that's coming from within the clinic walls, it's finally being freed and accessible by individuals, thanks to a lot of policy change and a lot of tech layers and a lot of companies that are, trying to crack that nut. And, if you look at just look at Medicare for a second. Medicare patients themselves can access and permission their own claims history, thanks to Blue Button 2.0. It's pretty revolutionary, right? When you think about it. And so then the third leg of the stool in my mind is of this kind of change over the last decade is that because person-generated and system-generated data can now be permissioned by the individual as the common denominator who owns it, we have the ability to capture and characterize health status over time with extremely high resolution, right? And so when you stand back from that, it's kind of remarkable that we're almost to the point in the real-world data or real-world evidence space that we're almost kind of taking it for granted because it seems so obvious that we should be able to do this. But it's quite technically complex. And again, just 7-10 years ago, we could barely imagine what we would be capable of doing now. And, I think to me, that's the sort of arc of change and the most important trends that we've seen over the last decade.
Whenever someone says that, 10 years ago, we could not imagine where we'd be now, it just always makes me think, well, where are we going to be in 10 years then? I mean,
generative AI, that's the answer, Jonah, to all questions about where we're going to be in 10 years. So it seems in the news anyway.
Well, but let's talk about AI. Do you guys use AI already? I'm sure in some ways. What are kind of the good and bad uses of AI in this space?
Yeah, so I will distinguish between AI and machine learning because we see them very differently. And, to put it all out there for the data scientists who are listening right now, please know that I am not a data scientist. My PhD is in mechanical engineering and bioengineering, not data science. So that said, that disclaimer out there, Evidation's data scientists would say that machine learning has been quietly disrupting things for a while with far less hype than AI. For example, we have a product that is running currently on the platform called FluSmart. And it is a nationally running program. And it is a program that's designed to passively detect individuals highly likely to be infected based on the person-generated data patterns that we see. And we're able to do that. We're able to sort of see something, do something in such a fast time frame that it enables us to help that person take action. For example, getting into a trial for new vaccines, getting into a trial for new antivirals, getting on therapy fast enough that it actually can have impact. And we're running this right now. We have about 180,000 people on one of these sort of FluSmart products running right now. That runs on a machine learning backbone, as do so many of our algorithms for COVID and detection of other, let's call them event-driven conditions or event-driven, health characterizations. To read more about this, we've actually just published a paper with BARDA on leveraging this kind of ML methodology for precision recruitment, especially for COVID-19 research, in showing that we can use these methods to yield a 4 to 7 times higher incidence rate of the right patients being targeted versus traditional approaches. So you're literally able to use machine learning-based methodologies to concentrate the number of people in the trial who actually are going to be in the arm where you want to see the events. That's that's really important. It's really important, not just for infectious disease research, but for many other conditions as well. AI is another matter. And, the healthcare sector, I think, is still very early with regard to how AI is going to impact health data use cases in particular, since that's kind of what we're talking about here. And, I sort of say we're at the magical moment where anything is possible, but any asymmetric risk that might actually be there hasn't yet been exposed. So we're sort of in that magical moment where we can all, imagine many different things. And if the past is prologue in technology adoption in healthcare, the biggest roles for true AI in the immediate term, I think, are going to land where the impact of being wrong has essentially no risk of causing harm to patients, like AI-driven data platforms for product lifecycle management or Salesforce efficiency, and of course, AI platforms for discovery of new druggable targets. A big thing we learned in the genomic data revolution, which was, think about it, when the genome was sequenced in 2006, we spent a solid decade just sort of getting our feet wet about what to do with that new technology and information. What we found is that use cases where the new technology or new genomic-based technology could enable physicians to do things they could not do before or treat patients they could not treat before were often going to be the most aggressively adopted. And I think that's probably going to come into play again. All that said, my personal view is that the real complexity, or one area of real complexity that's going to have to unfold here in the realm of AI use in the health data space, is going to be around regulatory pathways and regulatory labeling. I mean, think about it. Not all company or product AI engines are going to be made equal, any more than all manufacturing plants are. And so this could get very hard very fast in the sort of regulatory realm of labeling or product sourcing and labeling. So I think it's going to be fascinating and interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah. And I mean, it's not a podcast about AI, so we won't go too deep. There's so much we could talk about around a lot of the stuff that you mentioned. I think the no harm standard is a little bit of an AI soapbox for me, because the standard should be less harm than a comparable human,
Fair.
Right?
Yep. Fair.
And that's a kind of low bar depending on what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's totally fair, Jonah. Well said.
So one thing that occurs to me is, as we are moving into this age of AI, there's the garbage in, garbage out problem, and AI is only as good as the data sets it draws on,
right.
Which really brings us back to sort of where is our data coming from? What is our data in healthcare? And as you know, a lot of the historic large sets of healthcare data are plagued with problems about the way they were collected that can lead to bias in what any kind of AI would do with them, right? Like,
right.
The samples were not diverse, they were not representative. So to bring it back around to what you do, how do you make sure that when you're collecting data, that it's really reflective of the population it's meant to be measuring in every way that could matter, right?
Mm-hmm. So this thank you for asking that. I think it's an incredibly important thing for us all to be discussing and thinking about. And if you go back to Evidation's business model and our foundational principles of, on one side of our platform, we connect to individuals and permission data. And on the other side of our platform, we connect to our enterprise global customers. And in the case we're talking about here, our global pharma partners. In the case where it all for us has to start and stop with regard to diversity of the source of the data and richness and rich characterization of the data itself, has to start and stop with who are we getting it from, and how are we tapping into individuals and populations with certain conditions. Evidation today has a community of about 5 million people. They are geographically diverse in that they are representing about 9 out of every 10 U.S. zip codes in all 50 states. We've spent a lot of time over the last several years working on therapeutic area diversity, and we cover about 35 to 40 different therapeutic areas, therapeutic area kind of call them drug classes or therapeutic area categories. Our female to male split is usually, I'll call it 55-45 female to male, maybe 60-40, depending on when you look at the data. And our ethnic or racial diversity, we've always tried to tune to be representative of sort of census level demographics. And I would say we're better in some categories in that than others, but it's something that we're very, very serious about. In the cases where we're actually doing our own studies of coming, the communities are coming, people in communities are enrolling directly from Evidation to be enrolled in an Evidation study, we can balance those cohorts very easily, whether we're balancing it on gender, race, ethnicity, whether we're balancing it on socioeconomic or demographic principles, whether we're trying to balance it on educational levels. Like, we're completely in control of that and look through that lens in generally everything we do. It's a journey sometimes to make sure that our customers or our partners are actually on that road with us. For example, if we're going to recruit 100,000 people for an infectious disease study over the next, say, 3 weeks, I got to make sure that I'm explaining to my pharma partner that, maybe we should take 5 weeks, not 3 weeks, and make sure it's a fully balanced cohort in terms of racial demographics or ethnic demographics. I would say that conversation is pretty common now. I won't say it's 100% in terms of the reciprocity and the agreement to do that every single time, but I will say it's very, very common. And that just isn't something that we were taught to. People weren't coming to us asking for that 10 years ago. So I view that as a massive victory and a massive thing for all patients everywhere, because it means that we're better balancing the cohorts that end up in trials, whether they're in clinical development or whether they're in post-approval research, so that we actually can deeply understand what therapeutics are actually going to work best in what cohorts and what the real world effectiveness or efficacy gap may be, so that we don't find it out on the back end. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of like how we view sort of let's call it the data diversity problem, because it actually starts with a population diversity challenge.
That's a great answer. We're getting close to the end. There's one more thing I wasn't even planning to ask about, but I think you might have an interesting perspective on this, so give it a try. One of the things that's come up a lot in my conversations about the future of clinical trials is the notion that the whole concept of a control group could be radically changed in the future, if not eliminated, because we can use data in place of a control, and because a control group is kind of a bum deal when you're talking about potentially life-saving treatment. So what do you think about that? And is that kind of on your radar at all as you construct these studies?
It is, in the sense that, we've had many, many discussions at Evidation and with our research partners around, what is synthetic data controls? What do they look like? What do those data sets need to sort of aspire to be in the future? And our approach to that would be based on a foundation that we are able to longitudinally connect to people for years in the context of their everyday health, in the context of very specific therapeutic areas, in the context of whether they are on or off therapy. And again, going back to our prior question, in the context of having as broad a swath of diversity as we possibly can. And one of the reasons that at Evidation, we believe that longitudinal connectivity is important is if synthetic controls ever become widely accepted, I think they're going to rely on longitudinal characterization. It's not just going to be a 3-month snapshot where nobody was connected before and nobody was connected after. I think you could take a 3-month slice out of a 3-year data characterization or health characterization of an individual. But we don't always know when we start out what 3 months are going to matter, right? And so I think when we talk about synthetic controls or other types of synthetic data in that sense, I'm all for that, for exactly the reasons that you suggest in your question. But I think what's going to be important is that we actually have holistic characterization of health over long periods of time to be able to know that have confidence that what we're trying to model as a control is actually replicated by that experience.
Yeah, well said. It's a lot more complicated in practice than it is in theory.
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you.
So any other final thoughts or anything you'd like to talk about we haven't talked about yet, we can cover in, I don't know, a few minutes?
I think we've hit a lot. I'll say, maybe as a closing salvo, Jonah, I would say I think we're in a new era, and I know everybody says that, but I mean, I really believe we're in a moment where the full power of person-generated health data and more holistic health characterization is really gonna become not the exception in the real-world data space, but the norm, because I think it allows us with really unprecedented power and longitudinality to characterize disease in the lived experience to have it. B, enable the right individuals to participate in decentralized research and tech-enabled health programs, and C, to generate a new type of real-world evidence and proof of product impact at any scale. And I think those three things are not hypothetical. They are happening right now. And we couldn't say that 10 years ago. And so I do believe we're in a new area of health characterization where it is undeniable that the role of the data that we all as individuals generate in our daily lives and permission is going to have a big role. And so that's my closing salvo, Jonah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Deb. This has been a really interesting conversation, and I'm so glad you were able to join us.
Thank you so much, Jonah. I really enjoy the content and that you guys always write about and put out on your podcast, and I appreciate that you've given us a chance to participate in it.
That concludes this episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at pharmaphorum. Thanks for listening.